You can learn a lot about a people by learning about their gods, who the gods were, what they represented, what they did, and how they were revered tells you as much about the worshipper as the worshipped. The gods, great and small, are windows into culture through which we may squint, and glancing across the religious landscape, we may observe, sometimes in fleeting glimpses, and sometimes in sweeping vistas, a whole world view. This is one of the key points I hope this series has been illustrating, and if you've been following along, you'll know that our previous encounters with ancient Roman deities have brought us into contact as much with real Roman people as with their gods. Indeed, through our exploration of that busy pantheon of ancient Rome, it's the people themselves that often emerge more immediately, more human and more familiar for all their many differences in their hopes and fears, pleasures and aversions, their lives and loves and losses. In seeking out Rome's forgotten gods, then, Rome itself, the city, its people and its rhythms are also, hopefully, coming to life for you in fuller form and more robust colour than we generally receive from the often repeated grand political narratives of Roman history and the austere, if splendid, monuments of its state religion. The deity we'll meet in this episode is very much one of these gods who brings the real people of Rome closer to us. And at the same time, like many of the deities we've looked at so far, he takes us out of the city and the bustle of city life, back to the rhythms of nature and the natural world. He was one of the most popular deities of the ancient Roman world, and his became one of the most widespread cults in the Western Mediterranean. In terms of dedications, inscriptions, and archaeological evidence in the ancient capital, he was second only to Jupiter Optimus Maximus himself. And yet for all that, it's entirely possible you barely even know his name. He is the old father of the forest, the lord of the woods, the guardian of the shady grove. He puts us in a direct line of vision with the rustic heart of Roman religion, and yet he stood outside of public cult, just as he wandered outside of the city, in his leafy sanctuaries among the trunks of wild and wizened trees. Peripheral in our ancient literary sources, just as now he is marginal in history books and memory, he was once absolutely central to the personal devotions of multitudes. In some senses, this god and this episode is the big daddy of them all, in that this is a deity that makes us blink hard at the evidence and think twice about what we assume and think we know about the religion of ordinary Romans. To find him, we must abandon the marble temples and finely polished cult statues, step out of the lofty lines of poets, and leave the city and urbanity altogether. We must head for the woods. So, let us lay down our airs and graces and push on into the thickets, where the path disappears and the branches all tangle. Follow the fragrance of the pines into the deep, damp, breathing quintessence of the forest, and let us enter the realm of Silvanus. If you have ever come upon a grove that is full of ancient trees which have grown to an unusual height, shutting out the view of the sky by a veil of thickly intertwining branches, then the loftiness of the forest, the seclusion of the spot, and your awe at the dense, unbroken shade in the midst of the open spaces will assure you of the presence of a deity. So wrote the Stoic philosopher Seneca in a letter to a friend, and he's arguing that the divine reveals itself in nature. He appeals to primal consciousness to convince his friend of his point and invokes a common and sometimes unsettling experience, which you may have also experienced if you've ever had a quiet moment in the woods, that marvellous but prickling, eerie sense of not being alone when in the presence of great trees. Seneca had his cosmic god in mind, but for many ancient Roman readers, the divine presence lurking among the wild trees and filling the tangled grove with awe and dread was the lord of the forest himself, Silvanus, in his rightful place. In the topsy-turvy order of things that we've created in our modern world, such tracts of wild, untrammeled woods are now dismally rare and occur in isolated sections of land which we map, monitor, and cordon off as reserves and national parks. Over these pockets of precious trees, we've made ourselves protectors, and we mortals have taken on the role, for better or for worse, as guardians of the wild. The ancient experience was different. For them, it was civilization that occurred in pockets, admittedly increasing even then in size and number, but for all their farming and industry, the wilderness was still the norm, still the context against which all civilizing efforts were set. The woods, both mysterious and sacred, inviting and threatening, were always the wild counterpart to both urban and rural life, sidling up to cities, encroaching on the edges of farmland, shady, unknown, alive, and always emanating the divine. For the Roman, that spirit was Silvanus, the old guardian of the trees, in a world where trees were still venerated. Once upon a time, the elder Pliny tells us, trees were the temples of the divine powers, and even now, by rites of old, the rustic countryside still dedicate a tree of exceptional height to a god. Different kinds of trees had different divine patrons, as he explains. The different kinds of trees are kept perpetually dedicated to their own divinities. For instance, the chestnut oak to Jove, the bay to Apollo, the olive to Minerva, the myrtle to Venus, the poplar to Hercules. But for the forests overall, he tells us, we also believe that Silvanus and Faunus and various kinds of nymphs are, as it were, assigned to the woods from heaven and as their own special divinities. So the collective protection and guardianship of all the trees, the forest in sum, fell to Silvanus, alongside another god named Faunus, who we'll meet in the next episode, so we may just note his presence here. This responsibility for the trees is embedded in his very name. The Latin for the woods is silva, from which we derive English words such as the adjective sylvan, meaning something associated with the forest, such as a sylvan glade, and silviculture, meaning forestry, that is, the care and cultivation of a forest, generally to obtain some sort of product such as timber or seedlings. So, as Deus Silvarum, the god of the woods, Silvanus embodied the very spirit of the trees. He was therefore a rugged, hairy, and wild god. In human form, he appears as a rough old man, bearded and ungroomed. He forgoes the niceties of the civilized world and is generally naked, except for his boots and a cloak, which is often stuffed full of fruit and pine cones. Sometimes he carries a sickle, and he usually carries a branch, often of a pine, a tree with which he seems to have a particular affinity, or a cypress. And for this reason, the common epithet or nickname for him in Rome was dendrophorus, meaning tree-carrying. He is also often depicted accompanied by a dog, befitting his role as a woodsman, and he is, for all that he is rough around the edges, consummately benign. He's a kindly deity. He's calm, quiet, and peaceable, just like the trees he represents. We don't find with Silvanus the raunchy, raucous behavior associated with deities like Pan, the chaotic Greek god of unfettered nature. While Pan, in his uncontrolled lust, is depicted ravishing everything from nymphs to goats, and in his frequent revels is as unpredictable as he is badly behaved, to human sensibilities at least, Silvanus is harmonious and unashamed in his natural state, not because he embodies, like Pan, nature's every urge and instinct, but because he embodies the harmony of the forest as a whole, the balance of the overall ecosystem, despite its inherent lusts and violences in the details. We can see this, for example, in Silvanus's relationship with the troop of woodland nymphs that accompany him, known as the Silvae or the Silvanae, and this relationship is always depicted as pleasant and seemingly in a state of happy innocence. The Silvae, who seem rather modest by the usual standards of nymphs, are depicted clothed rather than naked, and they don't get subjected to the lascivious advances and ravages as do many of their other woodland counterparts. Indeed, some aspects of Silvanus's worship is known to have been exclusively for men and excluded women altogether. Giving instructions for a sacrifice to be made to him to protect cattle on the farm, Cato the Elder states that the offering must be made in silva, in the woods, inter dios, during the day, and then, after prescribing the amount of meat and wine to be offered, he states that both slaves and freedmen can make these offerings, and that after the ceremonials are over, the offerings must be consumed on the spot at once. In other words, a feast and merriment in the forest. However, Cato warns, a woman may not take part in this offering, nor see how it is performed. Now, this has given rise to some ill-informed opinions that Silvanus was a cult for males alone, which was patently not true because we have dedications from plenty of women. Clearly, this particular ritual was a male one, and there were a variety of gender divides among the worship of Roman deities, and we've seen some of these before, and we'll see it clearly again in a couple of episodes. But we shouldn't draw hasty conclusions. We can ignore, for example, the early church fathers who had some very strange ideas about Silvanus, because they also had a Christianizing agenda. Perhaps the best evidence against any definitive exclusion of women is nevertheless anecdotal, and it comes from a Christian source, albeit a late one from the 4th century CE, roughly. In a letter from Ambrosiaster, we learn of a woman called Valeria, who, journeying home to northern Italy, accidentally stumbled upon a group of what she deemed pagans, who were in the middle of worshipping Silvanus. The group then insisted that she too must make her offerings to Silvanus, but she performed her stubborn virtue signalling by announcing that she could not because she was a Christian. In other words, her reason to refuse was not because she was a woman. Clearly the group had no problem with this. It was her own Christianity that prevented her from making a peace offering to the god. Indeed, the gathering was so indignant and mortified by her refusal to rectify her intrusion on their ceremony by joining in and making an offering that they apparently mobbed her and sent her on her way so battered that she died of the wounds a few days later. We also have to take Christian accounts of the quote-unquote pagan world with large vats of salt, but the incidental and unintentional details like this one often give us snippets of important information. Christian hysteria aside, Silvanus as a god always emanates humbleness, humility, and the wisdom of slow and quiet fortitude. He's often referred to as pater, father, or Sanctissimus Pastor, most holy shepherd, reasons again for later Christianity to take against him. The idea of Silvanus as a shepherd may seem out of keeping with his role in the wilderness. agriculture and herding being the antithesis in some ways of nature, some scholars think this disparity needs explaining. But in the lived experience, I don't see that there's much of a contradiction here. Farmers, shepherds, huntsmen, and rural people lived, as I described, in pockets of cultivation and civilization within the perceived great wooded wilderness, which was still very much its own entity and presence. So people who lived in rural places lived not only with the sections of nature they controlled, but with the tangles of the roots and branches it disappeared into, and the numinous glades and hollows beyond. It makes perfect sense to me that a person engaged in cultivating the land lived at the same time very aware of the forces counter to which he or she was cultivating it. And just as farmers and country people are very attuned to the land on which they live and work, so they are also attuned to the wider natural world. Rustic people, in quite a literal sense, inhabited the hinterland between city and wilderness, an intermediary sort of a space between urban life and wild nature. And so it seems quite natural that the old man of the forest would know their flocks, the strays that stumbled off into the trees, the dens of the foxes and the wolves that threatened them, the birds that flitted blithely from the field to the forest, eating fruit and dropping seeds. And for this reason, it also doesn't seem strange that Silvanus was another god of boundaries. This seems a natural extension of how his woodlands bordered fields and roads and city walls. In fact, I think we might detect something of Silvanus in this passage from Varro, advising on planting trees along the edges of country properties. He says, "If there are no enclosures, the boundaries of the estate are made more secure by the planting of trees, which prevent the servants from quarrelling with their neighbours, and make it unnecessary to fix the boundaries by lawsuits. Some plant pines around the edges, as my wife has done on her Sabine farms. Others plant cypresses, as I did on my place on Vesuvius, and still others plant elms." In those pines and cypresses, we might imagine Silvanus was at the boundary line, patrolling the perimeter, just as he watched over the transition from the cultivated order to uncultivated wilderness. So he represented and looked out for the rural communities who lived alongside and well aware of his presence. Why then are we so unaware of his existence? Why is such an important and ubiquitous deity not a conspicuous part of our reconstructions of Roman religion? How did Silvanus slip from view and out of mind? I'd bet that many a classicist out there is, forgivably, unaware of just how much this deity predominated the ancient religious landscape. While most classicists and Roman historians would at least know of him and be able to provide a couple of factual snippets about him being a god of the forest and so on, I'm willing to stake all the coins in my money pouch to claim that beyond this, only those few who have, for some reason or other, had cause to focus on him directly, have ever thought about him in more depth. The rest are only passingly acquainted with him and could tell you little else. Most are certainly not aware that Silvanus was, enduringly, one of the Roman pantheon's most popular gods. What, by Jove, is going on here? By Jove indeed. Jupiter, enthroned in his glamorous temple on the dizzy heights of Rome's Capitoline Hill, central and elevated for all to see, sculpted on architectural reliefs with statues and statuettes across the ancient capital, across the empire, emblazoned on coins, celebrated in literature, in poetry, incorporated into the political and religious life of the city, Jupiter was indubitably Rome's deity par excellence. But where, in all this pomp and ceremony, was Silvanus? Well, pomp and ceremony are key words here, and the clue is in this publicity and visibility. The answer has something to do with the way that we do history, the sources we use, and sometimes the ancient attitudes we inherit and accidentally assume and even propagate from this evidence. So let me try to explain. There's a tendency, not only among the public, but also among historians, sometimes to conflate political propaganda with the ancient religious experience. What I mean is that Rome's grand temples and the splendid monuments and the art and the literature, they're all very seductive, and they were supposed to be. Ancient Romans, broadly defined, were also seduced by them. But it's easy to confuse all that majestic imagery and ideology with religion itself and religious sensibilities. This is a mistake, but it's a widespread one for many reasons, not least because there's clearly a large overlap, since Roman political propaganda was stuffed full of religious imagery, religious references, and religious ideology, and it's therefore a very good and very bountiful source of evidence for Roman religion. Nevertheless, it's not Roman religion. At least it's not the whole picture. It's a very partial, very curated vision, and as such it's representative of a very particular demographic, namely those with the power, the money, and the ambition to pay for and erect such temples, statues, and monuments. In other words, the elite. It's akin to reading the sculptural programme at Buckingham Palace as representative of the religious sensibilities of the British populace. This comparison isn't perfect, but it works well enough, so let's roll with it. Buckingham Palace, not unlike the civic buildings of ancient Rome, focuses heavily on imperial themes, national allegory, and emphasizes royal continuity. There are bronze allegorical figures of power, art, science, the army, the navy, and statuary that includes busts of the royal family, just as we might see Roman senators, generals, or emperors mixed up with divine and mythological characters. And this works, of course, because those tropes have real-world references that do have meaning, and viewers understand these meanings and perhaps sympathize with them. Maybe it represents their worldview, but maybe it doesn't. The point in either case is that those images are not innocent. They're consciously designed and intended to send a particular message about the people who commissioned them. Similarly, in the case of ancient Rome, when we're talking about civic art and architecture, those messages come overwhelmingly from the elite and are representative of elite tastes, concerns, and self-presentation. In fact, the Roman aristocratic and equestrian classes have coloured our vision of ancient Rome to an inestimable degree because they've left us so much of the evidence that we use, and they therefore mediate so much of what we learn about their society. The pen being mightier than the sword, this goes even more so for literature than art and architecture, because writers can communicate their message precisely and directly, and eloquently tell us across the centuries exactly what they want us to think about any given thing. And this is why historians are trained not to take the writers at face value and to read against the text and to question our own assumptions. Sometimes prejudices are voiced explicitly, other times they come to us obliquely, but sometimes prejudices, distastes, or disinterests are not even perceptible, because something omitted or ignored doesn't even enter the discussion, and we, millennia afterwards, don't even know what's fallen through the cracks. And this is apparently what happened to Silvanus. It's down just such a crack in elite disinterest that we almost lost him. For some reason, it seems that Roman high society was simply not that bothered with Silvanus. They don't speak badly about him, they just barely speak about him at all. His name pops up occasionally, such as in the text I read you earlier, in which Pliny explains that while various trees are assigned to various gods, the forest as a whole falls to Silvanus. And so his name is acknowledged there, and all the literate and educated people who read Pliny at the time clearly knew exactly who he was referring to. But without flourish or further ado, he simply moves on. And just like that, he's generally treated in Roman literature. References to him are few and far between. The reason, it seems, is that Silvanus was a rustic god and a deity of the common people. Indeed, where he gets that rare mention in the poets, it's only to underscore the most rough and ready of rural environments, best evidenced in Horace writing. The farmers of old, those tough men, blessed with little, after harvesting their crops with their faithful wives and slaves, their fellow workers comforted body and mind that bears all hardship for a hoped-for end, by propitiating earth with a pig, Silvanus with milk, and the genius who knows life's brevity with flowers and wine. Shaggy Silvanus, as Horace calls him, or as Virgil says, Silvanus with rustic honours on his brow. He was a simple, unkempt, humble god. He had no state temple and no official festival day, although he had a sacred grove just outside the city walls, and the poet Propertius even seemed to think that there had once been a grove of Silvanus in very early days, up on the Capitoline Hill. Despite his apparent ignominy, however, we know nonetheless of his enormous popularity among the humbler inhabitants of the Roman world, because against the balance of silence and Roman state propaganda and the other creative, intellectual outputs of the elite, we may read the archaeology and epigraphy, and this tells a very different story and fills in an enormous blank that we wouldn't otherwise even have been aware of. To the rescue of Silvanus came a study published in 1992 by Peter F. Dorsey, which collected this evidence together for the first time and showed just how neglected and overlooked a deity he was. Unfortunately, Dorsey himself died too young and too soon, only a couple of years after this publication came out, and the book doesn't seem to have made the dent in scholarship that it deserves. For as Dorsey writes in his introduction, Silvanus occupies a special place in the general polytheistic system in that he stood completely outside public cult. He had no state temple, festival or holy day. Despite his ancestral standing, he was never closely bound up with political and civic life, but remained the concern of the individual and the family. His unofficial status is not a sign of his inconsequence, though. Official recognition and imperial patronage are hardly the only indicators of a divinity's popularity. Well, here, I resoundingly agree, and get the feeling that Dorsey was a man after my own heart. Hundreds upon hundreds of inscriptions and dedications to Silvanus have been discovered. These are from ordinary people, paid for from private funds for personal reasons. Findings have been particularly numerous in Rome itself, where the rich and powerful nevertheless ignored him. For example, this is an altar to Silvanus from Rome that I spotted in the Capitoline Museum last summer. On the front is a dog, one of Silvanus's loyal companions, and above it reads Silvano Sancto Sacrum, sacred to blessed Silvanus, and below it tells us exactly who dedicated the altar and why. It reads, Chryses, slave of Lucius Clodius Justus Ignatius Priscus, manager for the storehouse and distribution of merchandise, and the workers in the Cella Civiciana. This was a storehouse for wine down near the river. Donated this altar after having a dream. He dedicated it on the Ides of January, in the year in which the consuls were Bolanus and Piso. This is apparently the year 111 CE. So I love this piece as a real slice of life, because here's an altar to Silvanus, funded and donated by the savings of a slave who managed a wine cellar because of a dream that he had. Dreams were often understood to contain wisdom and instructions from the gods, and a god seen in a dream was often understood to be a true epiphany. We might guess then that Silvanus himself visited this slave, this man, Chryses, in a dream, and whatever came to pass in the dream convinced him to spend some of his hard-earned money to have this altar made. On it, Chryses himself would have made his libations to Silvanus, who hopefully granted him his wishes. Others too would have poured their libations on this altar, perhaps among them the other workers from the wine cellar, and they too would have made their prayers to the old kind father of the forest. Here then is evidence of the cult of Silvanus very much alive, and here's one slave, one of the unsung multitudes who adored him, preserved in stone for posterity. There are so many. Here's another one, also from Rome, found near the garden of the Villa Medici. It's also from a slave, and it reads, "Sacred to Silvanus, Tucicus, slave of our Glabrio, keeper of the gardens, gave this in fulfillment of a vow." And here's another one, this one dedicated to both Silvanus and the genius of the Imperial Equestrian Guard. Remember that the genius is that numinous divine spirit of things. The inscription tells us that Marcus Ulpius Fructus, custodian of the temple, gave this image in relief with the base. We might wonder of what temple Marcus Ulpius Fructus was a custodian, or why he chose to dedicate this relief to Silvanus, but in any case he's gifted us a wonderfully classic image of the god, sickle in hand, clutching a branch, dog at his feet, mantle stuffed full of pine cones and forest fruits. So while the literature and vestiges of public religion would barely have us recognize Silvanus as anything more than a bumpkin deity in the shadows of the leafy wilderness, the archaeology and inscriptions of private individuals show us, in great numbers, just how venerated and popular this god really was. What doesn't make any sense to me, and what doesn't quite add up, is that elite Romans loved what they viewed as their honest rustic roots. Aristocrats loved to posture as rural folk on their country estates, and they venerated many of the other deities which were bound up with the fertility of the land, and they celebrated their festival days and harvests. As we know very well, even in their mythical origins, the Roman people imagined they had arisen from a rustic forest context. Romulus and Remus, Rome's twin founders, were suckled by the lupa, the legendary she-wolf under future Rome's most venerable fig tree, and they were rescued and brought up as rustics by a herdsman and his wife. So why would Silvanus, an ancestral and local deity, very much in keeping with these rural virtues and aesthetics, not similarly be embraced? Peter Dorsey's answer was that as the rural people drifted more and more into urban centres like Rome in search of work and new opportunities, they brought Silvanus with them, and over generations in the city, he became representative of the urban poor and their nostalgia for a lost and rustic past. But I'm not sure I entirely buy into that explanation, although I've nothing to offer in its place. It's certainly true that although he was a deity of the woods, the prayers and dedications people made to him in the inscriptions are all sorts of personal and pragmatic things related to everyday life and not concerned with rural or sylvan matters specifically. But that's nothing unusual in itself. It happens with any deity someone might take on as a personal divine patron. And it seems also from the evidence from inscriptions that a vast array of people came to Silvanus for aid and protection, and while these don't seem to come from the highest echelons of society, nor are they all from the very lowliest. So while the elite might have gotten a bit sniffy about slumming it with the vulgus, as they called them, as the masses, it cannot be that Silvanus was considered representative only of society's most downtrodden members. There are inscriptions from gladiators and eye doctors, merchants and temple custodians, slaves and sculptors and scribes, maybe not the most fashionable of crowds, but surely not much different from the crowds that poured into any other given temple. But it's thought anyway that Silvanus became associated as a god of the common people, peasants and slaves, and this is why the elite didn't pay him much attention. We do hear that the Vestal virgins once had to offer sacrifices to a fig tree in front of the temple of Saturn, in the Forum before it was removed because it had grown to such a size that it was starting to bother a statue of Silvanus. And this is a glimpse that indeed he had a statue, at least, in a prominent place in the Forum, and the statue was important enough to warrant the digging up of a tree and the attentions of the Vestals to protect it. And it strikes me also that, given his character, there might have been some natural resistance to building a temple to such a god when sacred groves and altars in the woods were much more suited to his preferences and wild nature. There would almost be something perverse about dragging a rugged and nature-loving deity into the city in his naked and uncultivated state and forcing him into the confines of a static stone temple to answer urban prayers. And yet, in the end, it's the stones, the inscriptions and the fragmental remains of his urban cult that have saved Silvanus from oblivion. What Silvanus and the evidence for him shores up, then, is a gulf between official state religion and what we might call folk religion. But given that the elite made up a mere 1% of the populace, in reality, what the other 99% were up to, whatever you want to call it, surely that is the real religion, state, official or otherwise. And so much of the Roman religious experience that we've encountered through the deities in this series has been very earthy and grounded in the observance of and reverence for the natural world. Folk religion by any other name, airing the considerations and concerns of ordinary people. Silvanus shows us just how much we can miss about real everyday life due to the kind of evidence that was created and what of it survives. Silvanus, the great tree father, fits perfectly into the worldview that we've been exploring in our excursions into the shadows of Olympus. Simple and rugged on one hand, and bounteous and verdant on the other, he's a god that exudes the good life inherent in the simple life, and the gentle generosity of nature. The trees, with juices that gave mellowness to man, as Pliny puts it, gave many gifts to humankind. However, as we emerged from the natural state and started to use the trunks of those gentle giants as commodities to fuel civilization, Pliny, in his own times, observed an all too familiar degradation that he describes with rhetorical flourish and palpable disgust. From trees, he writes, are obtained olive oil to refresh the limbs, and draughts of wine to restore the strength, and in fine all the savours that come by the spontaneous generosity of the year, and the fruits that even now served as a second course, in spite of the fact that battle must be waged with the wild beasts to obtain them, and that fishes fattened on the corpses of shipwrecked mariners are in demand. Moreover, there are 1,000 other uses for those trees, which are indispensable for carrying on life. We use a tree to cross the seas and to bring the lands nearer together. We use a tree for building houses. Even the images of the deities were made from trees before men had yet thought of paying a price for the corpses of huge animals, or arranged that inasmuch as the privilege of luxury had originated from the gods, we should behold the faces of the deities and the legs of our tables made of the same ivory. So Pliny observes the great utility of trees while observing in the same breath the fall from sacred to profane in the quest for material things. We can get very attached to trees and feel very emotional about their loss. There was a national outcry in the UK in 2023, for example, at the loss of the much-loved 120-year-old sycamore tree at a bend in the valley of Hadrian's Wall, known as Sycamore Gap. This was illegally and senselessly chopped down by two men in an act of drunken stupidity. And there was an outpouring of grief at the act of wanton violence and vandalism against this iconic and peaceful presence and the hole left in the landscape where it fell. The two perpetrators in the end received a jail sentence of 4 years and 3 months, showing that the sap flowing in the life of a tree still resonates with our own life blood in primal, deeply felt and evidently emotive ways. Homer, in that greatest of epics, the Iliad, often compared life cut short on the battlefield to the sad and untimely felling of a tree. However, in one battle scene, in the thick of the fight and all its bloodshed, the Trojan hero, Glaucus, suddenly perceives human life in relation to the trees as resilient and immortal, even as individuals come and go. He cries out, "Like the generations of leaves are the generations of men. The wind scatters the leaves to the ground, but the living wood puts forth new shoots. Burgeoning in the season of spring returning, so too one generation of men will grow, while another dies." And so in that relentless passage of people across the ages, I'll leave you not with the immortal words of the great poets, but with the words of long-forgotten ordinary people who have otherwise come and gone like leaves, but who have accidentally left a mark on history and posterity in their prayers and dedications to their much-beloved guardian of the trees. Here are some of their offerings to Silvanus. From Rome. Callistus, bailiff of Caius Caelus Halus, gave this sacred gift to the divine Silvanus. From the Roman port at Ostia, an altar dedicated to Silvanus, Titus Flavius, imperial freedman, Primiganius, assistant keeper of archives. From ancient Trimontium, now in the Scottish borders, to the god Silvanus, Gaius Arius Domitianus, centurion of the 20th Legion Valeria Vitrix, for the welfare of himself and his family, gladly, willingly, and deservedly fulfilled his vow. From Colchester in Roman Britain, to the god Silvanus, Calirius Contismus, the coppersmith, willingly and deservedly fulfilled as a gift his vow. And my favourite, from Titus Pomponius Victor in the Alps of southern Gaul, evidently a homesick Roman pining for the trees of his homeland. Silvanus, half enclosed in a sacred ash tree and supreme guardian of this high garden, we gratefully dedicate this poem to you, because you brought us through the fields and through the alpine mountains, and we are guests of your sweetly smelling grove, while I administer the law and carry out the business of the Caesars with your protecting favour. Bring me and mine safely back to Rome, and grant that we may tend the Italian countryside under your guardianship. Then I shall consecrate to you 1,000 great trees. Surely the most fitting and luxurious gift of all. Let's hope Titus Pomponius Victor made it back to Italy and Silvanus got his 1,000 trees. And let's hope somewhere in the quiet shade of a wooded valley in the Italian countryside, its descendants still stand tall, still stand testament to the kind and humble father of the forest, to the people who worshipped him, and most of all, to the enduring, breathing sanctity of the trees.